In 5, 4, 3.
Pierre Burton's, I'll read it because I'll never remember, described the scene as an oversized living room with 6 performers sweating under the glare of 18,000 watts, the thin paper facades, everyone caught up by the ravenous appetite of the most complicated entertainment medium yet devised. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, it was a very small room we had to do our experiments in at the beginning. As usual, the politicians of the country, of course, had misgauged the importance of communications and culture. They got into the game too late, and a lot of that was because Ottawa got no television at all, and Montreal very little, and it was rather heavily snow-covered in Montreal. But Canadians in the thousands were buying TV sets in southern Ontario, southern British Columbia, anywhere near the border, and turning them to American television, long before Parliament decided, on the basis of the recommendation of the Massey Commission, that they should get into television. Now, the Massey report came in 1951, which was already desperately late. So late, in fact, that we were told to fire ahead with television appointments and buying equipment and so on, even before the Massey report came out, because it was leaked to us that they were going to propose it, and the government had said they would not oppose it. So we got into it very late in the day with too little money. There's a story I tell in the book about the time just a week before we went on the air, when we realized there was absolutely no way we could meet the commitment without hiring 20 more people on staff. And so we proposed to hire them on performers' contracts, which didn't require an establishment position, you see. And we wangled that through Ernest Bushnell, who was then in Ottawa as vice president of programs. And he went into collusion with us, winked at it, knew what we were doing, pretended he didn't hear a thing on the phone line when we told him about it. And of course we put nothing in writing. So we went ahead and did that. It was the only way we could get on the air. Bushnell was nearly fired about this later when it was discovered that he had been in collusion with us, breaking the rules that way. But it was the only way it could be done. And I don't think Canadian television ever recovered from that late start. I think the Canadians' viewing habits, their aerials were tuned towards the United States. And the consequence was they knew and were familiar with the American shows. The job of competing with them, especially when so many sets in those days didn't bother to retune their aerials to pick up the CBC, it was an almost impossible battle. It was a lot easier in the province of Quebec. They had been slower about getting into it, building themselves a good production plant there, because there was no competition from the Americans to speak of. And they were dealing with another language. And the people in the CBC and the civil servants in Montreal and Ottawa just simply did not grasp this. They were way behind the times and out of step. Had they got into television when they should have, which was 5 or 6 years earlier, not long after the war, had they provided the proper funds to do it, had they said to us, go on the air for 6 hours a day instead of 2, that's all we had the money for, 2 hours a day. How can you woo viewers with 2 hours a day when they can get American broadcasts at any time? So we started behind the 8 ball, and I do not believe we've ever really come out from behind it.
Can you give us a sense of what it was like the day that you signed on, leading up to the Upside Down test pattern?
Well, it was an enormous rush. The training was a big enterprise, and we had a remarkable group of young people whom we'd selected very carefully from across the country. People like Norman Jewison and Art Hiller, who's already in Hollywood, has been for many years. And directors who are now all over the world, and associate directors, assistant directors, floor managers, even the stage hands. Ted Kotcheff, who's now a big Hollywood director, started as a stage hand, just shifting furniture around. But it was 2 years of extremely intense training. We imported some of our teachers. We brought up Rudy Bretz, who is the greatest practical teacher of television in the world. And we brought up others to tell us about what was happening in the vanguard and the avant-garde of television. But we used Canadian teachers whenever we felt we had a mastery of the medium, as we did with film, for instance. By that time, the National Film Board had been in operation for 10 years, since 1941. So we had all their know-how to call upon, and one of their leading directors, Sidney Newman, came down and joined us at the beginning, and he was one of that early team too. So it was a back-breaking preparation over 2 years to hit there, and it was a fairly tense moment when it happened. And the slide going in, up and down, was only the most vivid and certainly the most public of the things that happened as a result of that tension. I think I mentioned in the book another one, which audiences, of course, were quite unaware of, that in the opening drama that we did, the full-length drama we did, called Call It a Day, we did it with 2 cameras, which, was economizing, should have been done with 3. And the concentration was so intense that the cameraman on the high camera fainted, and jacked up as he was in the air. So the director was, first of all, left with 1 camera when the whole thing had been plotted for 2, and it was all live again. There was no taping. What you saw was what you got was what you saw. But the guy handling the cable behind the trolley camera realized what had happened, and without a second thought, just purely instinctively, he looked around at the control room and went like that, and got a nod from the director. I was behind the director in the control room, and he climbed up and got into the seat, and somebody else, one of the electricians, I think, came to pull cable for him. And the director, who has now lived in Vancouver for many years, Peter MacDonald, earned immortality by shepherding them through the show. He was taking shots on camera 1 when he could, and while he was on camera 1, he was then lining up camera 2, saying, "Now I want you to go over here, take your time, now dolly in, that's right, a little tighter, okay, hold it there," cut from 1 to 2 and then back again. Guided the cameraman, who never had a minute's rehearsal, you see, through the whole of the rest of the show. But the audience never knew that, never saw that. The upside down thing has become famous simply because it could scarcely have been more visible.
When we talk about what it was personally for you to be part of this amazing process, it was interesting for you to put in that little aside of walking around Toronto and bumping into your philosophy teacher. Did it sort of shatter your, momentarily, what you were thinking about in terms of what you thought you were accomplishing? Oh,
not at all. Not at all, no. It confirmed for me the fact that that most university teachers simply had no grasp of what was happening. There was a story told in New York when I was there about the 2 professors who met on the street, and one of them said, "I don't know what we're going to do with the television." He said, "It's ruining society. The kids are becoming thugs. The churches are being emptied. You can't get people out to meetings." He said, I can't get my wife out of the house." He said, just destroying American society. And the other professor said, "I know what you mean. We haven't got a set either." And so that was very much the attitude I knew that most academics had. But it was put particularly bluntly to me by my philosophy professor, Fulton Henry Anderson, when I met him at the library. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said rather proudly, "We're putting a television network on the air, sir." And he said, putting his arm around me, clapping me on the back, he said, "Oh, Moore, when are you going to quit fucking around?" And that was very much the attitude, that that's what the people in academic circle believed that's what television was. And then I went on to a later meeting with the leading lights of the University of Toronto. And some of them were lights indeed, very bright lights, to talk about what use television might be to them. Not one of them had a television set, not one. Nonetheless, they talked about television in the most denigrating terms and quite dishonestly comparing it with the best of literature. Well, anybody can play that trick. To compare the worst of television with the best of literature, to compare postcards with the contents of the Louvre, it's ridiculous. But it took them a long time to realize what they had. When the Toronto Board of Education was similarly called together to discuss the use of television in schools, they spent almost the whole time arguing whether they should have television cover their meetings. They had no conception of what it could do in the classroom.
Actually, it was interesting that the reviews that came out after that first evening, how typical, in a sense, that the comparison between the Canadian reviewers, to a large extent, and what actually was said from the American reviewers.
Yeah. The Canadian reviewers just kind of mocked it. They belittled it, and pontificated about how it wasn't bad, but it really wasn't very good, and so on. Whereas the papers in Buffalo, where Buffalo was the biggest of the American cities that could pick up CBC Toronto then, and they raved about it, said it was better than what happened when American television opened, and that the American networks could, with value, copy a lot of what CBC was doing. Some of our ideas were pretty original, too, that we were trying out. But this, again, is an old story in Canada. If you try to do something original here, there will be plenty of people saying it was a failed attempt to be a la mode, that you were trying to be like the Americans and failed, rather than, oh boy, we've got something that distinguishes us from the Americans. A great many Canadians think that way.
In fact, the Americans had to follow us, in a sense, in one time with the story of the Coronation Tapes.
Yeah, when we were the first to get the Coronation Tapes across the pond from Britain, there were no satellites in those days, and we beat both the leading American networks, NBC and CBS, and the smallest of the American networks, ABC, had decided to go with us anyway. They had bought our feed. But then when we landed our tapes before NBC, and CBS was having plane troubles in London, hadn't even got off the ground, NBC decided to take our feed too. So there was this remarkable moment when the network was reversed, so to speak. And out of Montreal, through Toronto, to Buffalo, we were feeding the program to two of the three American networks. But we found afterwards that at least 3/4 of the Canadians viewing had watched it on the Buffalo station. Force of habit, you see. That's what I meant by our getting too late into the game. But no, we had these triumphs, and we had prize-winning television shows within 2 or 3 years, while international prize winners, while the Canadian critics were still damning the CBC for putting out third-rate stuff.
Would General Motors Presents be one of those that you were referring to in terms of, was that a fairly successful with Sir Cedric?
Hardwick, yeah, that was very good. That was one of the first drama programs that we got sponsored. General Motors came in to sponsor that. And I talked Cedric Hardwick, whom I'd known for some years, to come up from New York and host it. He'd just been made a knight at those times. And I said, come on, the Canadians know what knighthood's all about. The American don't. Come and make use of it. So he came up for about half his usual fee. And he was astonished. He told the press, he told anyone who would listen that the Canadians are doing better dramas with less fou-for-all and more economically in terms of equipment and so on than the Americans were. But the Canadians were the ones who wouldn't believe this, typically.
One last bit about one of your challenges was finding programming, inexpensive programming, and it was interesting your story about going after the Christmas parade and having it perhaps sponsored by Simpsons.
Yeah. Well, that was a story about Stuart Griffiths, who had that same tough sense of professionalism I was talking about that my mother and her generation had. Yeah, we were looking for programming, preferably cheap. And we noticed that the Eton parade was coming up on the following Saturday. And I said to Griffiths, we really ought to make some arrangement with Eton's to cover that. And he said, why make some arrangement with Eton's? It's on the street, it's public property. And I said, oh, well, you couldn't just take somebody's material like that. I said, you got a 2-hour program there. And Griffiths said, well, what about all the people in their homes who want to see it? And that's all good advertising for Eton's? Shouldn't Eton's pay for that? And I said, well, maybe you could, give them a gift to the children in the parade or something. And Griffiths said, oh, no, I'm going to get them to sponsor it. This is going to cost them $1 million or whatever. And he phoned them up and they told him to go to hell, of course, that if they covered the parade, Eton's could do nothing about it. It was in the public domain. But since they had advertising all through it, they didn't see why they should spend a nickel to put commercials onto it for the greater glory of the CBC. And so Griffiths phoned Simpsons, who were the Eton's great rivals at the time, and said, would you like to buy the Eton's parade? And the Simpson people thought that was a brilliant idea. They would put their commercials onto the Eton show and swipe it, as it were. Well, when word got back to Eton's, they backed down in a hurry and sponsored it for, 20, 25 years after that, annually. And it cost them a lot of money. But those were kind of piratical days, when we were making the rules. Nobody really knew what was done and what doesn't. We were inventing things as we went along.
When you decided to get out of CBC for a while and take a break, you were invited down to Stratford and by Tyrone Guthrie. And perhaps talk a little bit about that experience. I mean, it wasn't one of your best experiences, I guess, and also your impressions of working with Tyrone under those.
Well, Guthrie was a fabulous director, and I had by this time got to know him quite well. And he had tried to get me to come to Stratford in the first season, but that was the very year in which we were launching television, and I said, there's no way I can do it. But he approached me again in the second season, which was 1954, when we'd been on the air for 2 years. And I could see myself in television just because I had started near the top of the ladder as I could see myself being kicked upstairs pretty quickly and spending the rest of my life behind a desk, which I didn't want to do. So when Guthrie asked me again, I said, well, I really want to direct. But I'll come and act if that's what you'd like. And he thought that was the best idea for starters. And so I was offered the role of Petruchio in The Taming of the Shrew and a couple of others in the other plays. And it was a very strange experience indeed, because what he wanted to do with the play he never discussed with me. And we never even had a read-through. And as a consequence, when we started rehearsals, we went right into staging before we'd had any discussion of character or what line he was taking with the play, or what the designs were going to be. And as a matter of fact, he had a thoroughly wacky idea about producing it as a kind of traveling Wild West show. And he told me nothing about this. So I didn't know where we were at in rehearsals. And he'd keep saying to me something like, well, that doesn't work, try this. And I was rusty in any case. I'd been 4 years away from the theater. But it just destroyed my self-confidence. But fortunately, as we came up to the final week of rehearsals, I blew it in another way. I tripped on the stage and fell onto a metal trash can that was in the gully and broke 2 ribs, and there's no way I could do it. I stayed for the rest of the summer playing an old man, Aeschylus, in Measure for Measure, but there's no way I could do Petruchio, so that I was gotten out of that without too great a disgrace. But what would have happened if I hadn't done that and hadn't had to withdraw, I don't know. It was an unhappy experience simply because I had so much admiration for him. But we got it sorted out afterwards. It was a kind of an Alphonse and Gaston business. He was waiting for me to show what I wanted to do with the role, and I was waiting for him to tell me what he wanted. And we didn't meet on that.
I wanted to talk about some of your personal challenges with putting on productions. Sunshine Town was one that you had a lot of things to overcome, particularly with trying to find funding in those days or something like that.
Well, this was a huge production for its day, much the biggest production of a musical in Canada that had ever been tried. Its only predecessor, I guess, was The Dumbbells, which had been an extraordinary army variety show, all men doing female impersonations in the show and so on, which had not only been a great success in Canada, but had gone down to Broadway and had a quite respectable run there. But since the days of the Dumbbells, which had quit in about 1929, the World War I show, there had been no attempts to do a large-scale Canadian musical. And this was the works. It had huge scenic effects, large cast, singers and dancers, and a very large cast of characters in there. So it was a tremendous challenge, but I was kind of determined to do it. And I had to work hard getting the money, and we never knew really from moment to moment whether we would have enough. We were running on our box office advance, which is strictly speaking illegal. Money which goes into a box office has been paid in there to people getting their tickets expecting to see the show. And if you go bankrupt before it opens, you're in terrible, terrible trouble. But we were having to finance it sort of as we went. And while the show was in rehearsal, even in its final stages of rehearsal, even while it was running, I was going around trying to pick up $2,500 here and $5,000 there. And it was one of those successes that lost a lot of money. It was supposed to have cost $50,000 and it cost $75,000. And I had signed for most of that on my own note of hand. I hadn't asked them to invest in the show. I'd asked them to lend me personally the money. And I found myself, when it was finished, $30,000 in debt. 10,000 of it was in unpaid bills, and the other was money I'd borrowed. So I had to climb out of that somehow, and this was one reason that I revived Spring Thaw, which was a pretty sure moneymaker. And before very long, of course, I was able to raise money very simply for Spring Thaw by getting investors in it. They were getting a return, and I could show them the figures over 2 or 3 years, you see. They were getting a return of about 200% in 6 months, which is good in anybody's language. So I had no trouble raising money for that afterwards. But the one that indoctrinated me, that trained me in raising money and in doing things inexpensively, was Sunshine Town.
From that, one of the things I do want to talk about is the Charlottetown Festival, because if you were primarily responsible for that development?
Yeah, it was my idea. They brought me over to Charlottetown. I was acting and directing in Halifax at the Neptune Theatre. When they asked me to come over, look at the theatre which they were building in the Confederation Center in Charlottetown and advise them what to do with it. And, you know, their humility, the humility of that remarkable board was very much like the humility the Stratford board had shown to Guthrie. Guthrie had said to them, what do you want to do? What do you propose to do with this? And they said, oh, you tell us. We want your ideas. And that's exactly what the board at Charlottetown did with me. And it was very, very hard to say no. It was a superb theater, although what was up at the time was only the poured concrete. The seats weren't in, the stage wasn't in. And they asked me to run their centennial, which was in 1964, 3 years ahead of the rest of the country, because it was in 1964 that the Fathers of Confederation had met in Charlottetown. And it was a lead up to the National Centennial in '67, and a kind of an interesting proving ground for the federal government. So they gave us the money to hold such a festival as has never been held before or since in Canada, with companies and individual artists, just the greatest in the country. I mean, we had John Vickers and Maureen Forrester and you better cut this bit out while I reach for names. Well, both Glenn Gould and the greatest of our jazz pianists. I'm getting tired.
We can skip over that part.
What's his name? The great black jazz pianist. Oscar Peterson, yeah. So I'll go back over that bit. And we had Glenn Gould and Oscar Peterson. We had new films from the New Film Board. We flew one company, which Jean Gascon directed incidentally, across the country it closed in Vancouver on Saturday night and opened in Charlottetown on Monday night. This had never been done in America. No one had tried to fly anything from the West Coast to the East or vice versa over the weekend. Scenery and everything. We had Gélina in there doing scenes from one of his plays. It was an extraordinary summer festival. And that really put the thing on the map, but what drove it home was the following year, '95, when I commissioned a musical to be made of Anne of Green Gables. One had been written, a short one, for CBC Television by Don Harron and Norman Campbell, and I commissioned them to prepare a full-length one for the stage. And that was an instant and sort of global success. It was picked up by the New York Times, picked up by the Japanese newspapers, by the London newspapers, and set the festival off on a rare path.
You've done a lot of musicals, haven't you? Quite a few with Don Harron. You're known for...
Well, I've known Harron since he was a student, yes.
Two quick more questions. One was, I just wanted to get a sense of what it was like. The development of the National Arts Centre was where you met Hirsch, Gascon, Lang, and Major to talk about regional theatre and maybe its future and what took place then.
The National Arts Centre was a curious beast because it was originally proposed as a national institution, but in Ottawa. Now, as everybody in the country knows, it is next door to impossible to run anything out of Ottawa. I'm thinking the Opera House in Ottawa. Besides which, you have the two biggest production centers in the country nearby, Montreal and Toronto. But the notion of the National Arts Centre really was to civilize Ottawa, to raise the profile of the nation's capital, to give it a first-class venue for the diplomats who came to the country, for visiting dignitaries from other countries, for the Ottawa people themselves, who are, of course, well above the national average in education and intelligence, because most of them are civil servants and of a pretty high grade. So there was this argument that we must have something in Ottawa which is of national stature. But they never resolved this terrible problem that most tourists, most Canadians come to Ottawa in the summer. What do you do with the National Arts Centre the rest of the year? In a word, the height of the tourist season is 2 summer months, maybe 3 if you stretch it with 2 weeks at either end. Whereas the real work of the centre has to go on for all the other months of the year without the benefit of the 7 or 8 million tourists who come to Ottawa because it is the national capital. You cannot rely on tourists. How are you to make that national? And this was the big argument from the very beginning and was the source of that little meeting that we held with leaders from across the theatres of the country, saying what sort of theatre company can we have in Ottawa? Ought it to be just a place where groups from all across the country travel so that they can appear in Ottawa? Or should the centre have its own theatre companies which tour? Should it have, in that case, 2 touring companies, one in French and one in English? And should the base of those theatre companies be in Ottawa, or should you have an English company based in Toronto but working through the National Arts Centre to arrange its tours, and a French company based in Montreal doing the same throughout Quebec and perhaps into New Brunswick and so on? And this was never resolved. My suggestion, which was never picked up, though we could easily have done it, was to have a bilingual company, which would have been like nothing else on the face of the earth. There are other countries which have bilingual companies. Ireland, the Abbey Theatre in Ireland, by law, has to do an Irish one-act piece every time they do an English piece. Nobody sticks around for it. One of the times I saw this happen, the house was full for the Irish play, but there were 6 people left, including me. I'm sorry. The house is full for the Irish play in English, like Sing or O'Casey, but the play in Irish, in Erse, had 6 people there, including myself. So it's a very difficult feat, but in Canada we had enough actors who, if they had agreed to play a lead in one play and a smaller part in the other, could have provided a company playing, let's say, both Shakespeare and Molière and travel the world in it, and perhaps get some Canadian plays worked into the mix too. I thought it was a great idea. But there were others who said, where can we find the actors who are good enough? Look, it's a simple matter to train actors if they've a good ear. And it might not have been overnight possible to do as a really first-class company, but I think in a year or 2 you would have had a company that was unequaled in the world. However, it partially fell down because of politics. The people at Stratford were riding high, and they were determined to get a foothold in Montreal to cement their prestige, or failing that in Toronto. So they proposed that Stratford play a winter season in Montreal and then go to Ottawa. In other words, Stratford would be running the whole thing. The other proposition was that you'd start a company in Toronto, get it going, get it off the ground, and then move it, an English company, move it to the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. And as was pointed out, you really can't do that. You can't build a company sufficiently exciting that one place takes to it and then say, sorry, chaps, we're going to move somewhere else. But they've never solved that problem. The tours of Canada, which have been undertaken by the National Arts Centre theatre companies, have never worked properly. It's often worked better the other way when visiting companies from Winnipeg or Vancouver or wherever perform in the National Arts Centre. This still happens. But they've never solved this basic dilemma. Is it a national institution? Is it for the residents?
Well, those words will end.
Okay.
And I thank you.